Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Martin. I'm on the steering committee for the League of Women Voters U.S. Interest Group on Migration. And I will be moderating this session with Nancy Krell, who will join me just a minute. But I'd like to thank all of you for coming to this, what I think will be a really interesting meeting on what's happening at the border. I think most of us follow the news reports and have an idea of what's happening, but our speakers today are living the situation and doing a lot of work to help the migrants who are coming across the border and to make sure that they have access to the assistance and to the legal help that they need. Let me begin by asking that if you are new to the interest group meetings, if you would please give us your email addresses, preferably in the chat. And if you don't want to share your address with everyone, your name and address with everyone, feel free to do it through the private chat to either, let's see, I guess best to Catherine Gapsey, who's the one who has been in touch with you with regard to their to your participation in this meeting. And this way we can let you know about future meetings that we hold on immigration issues. I want to just start our discussion with very, very briefly making the point, which I think will be elaborated more in the discussions, that the concerns about the movements across the U.S.-Mexico border aren't new. The first inspection centers, vehicle stations that were put along the border occurred in the late 19th century. In 1924, the Border Patrol was founded in part because of prohibition and stopping the movement of liquor across the border, but also because there had been legislation passed in 1924 that made it much more difficult for people to come into the country and remain as immigrants. And the Border Patrol was this was the first time there was an actual effort to patrol the border in a systematic way. The restrictions eased a bit during World War I because of labor shortages, but then built up again. And during the Depression, we had the first mass deportations across the border of mostly Mexican migrants who were seen as competition. During World War II, the U.S. adopted the Bracero program with Mexico to allow Mexican workers to come legally across the border. But in the 1950s, while that program still was in existence, there was probably the largest single mass deportation under the very unfortunate name of Operation Wetback, in which about 4 million mostly Mexican migrants were deported, some of whom were U.S. citizens who got caught up in the deportation processes. The Bracero program ended in 1964, largely because of some of the very, very bad labor practices that were passed. By the 1970s, there was, again, a lot of concern about what was occurring on the border. And a commission was formed that I was the research director for it to try to figure out what could be done with the border. And that led to the 1980s to the Immigration Reform and Control Act, the legalization of a lot of undocumented migrants in the country, but also the the need for, or the assumed need for, more rigorous border enforcement. And in 1986, when that legislation was passed, there were 1.7 million apprehensions along the Mexican border. In the 1990s, the border tightened up more through use of deterrence methods and fencing. Border Patrol tremendous increase in the number of Border Patrol officers. And then in the 2000s, we saw various different things occurring at the border because of 9/11 to try to prevent terrorists from coming across. And then later on in 2014, there was another major surge of people trying to enter, particularly from Central America. And so this is something which we have seen before, will likely see again. But there are some nuances and changes now, and I think we'll hear from our speakers about some of the current problems, issues, and opportunities along the border. I'm going to turn this over now to Nancy to introduce our first speaker, and then I'll be introducing our second speaker. So Nancy, and you're muted.
Well, let's unmute that. I'm Nancy Krom. I'm with the League of Women Voters Houston. I'm really glad you guys are all here. I am pleased and to get to introduce Andrea. Interesting, wonderful person. So Andrea, seeing a need for newly arriving immigrants, she founded Team Brownsville in 2018, along with a couple of other former educators. Since that time, she and Team Brownsville have worked tirelessly to meet some of the needs of the people immigrating to the U.S. through Brownsville, Matamoros, and McAllen, Reynosa international entrances. As U.S. policies and situations change, the specific needs that Team Brownsville provides have also changed over the years. But one thing is for sure, Team Brownsville is committed to helping the plight of the immigrant however they can, from preparing and serving meals to at the encampments in Matamoros, to having meals catered through a restaurant in Matamoros for a while when things were too dangerous for her volunteers to go over, driving supplies across the border herself, shopping numerous times daily at Walmart and Sam's, both in Brownsville and Matamoros, to providing clothing and needle formula and baby bottles and lots of diapers and wipes, as well as run the Welcome Center, which is about 2 blocks from the Brownsville International Bridge. This is where immigrants are first released into the United States. Team Brownsville volunteers are the very definition of kind and wonderful and giving hearts. They use volunteers from all over the United States who donate money, as well as actually go to Brownsville to see for themselves what's really happening. I can attest from personal experience that once you work along Team Brownsville, your perspective shifts and frankly, your life changes. Every time I volunteer at the border, things have changed. But there's Team Brownsville adapting and adjusting to help our new residents. I am so proud to introduce you all to Andrea Morris-Rudnick, a tireless volunteer who incidentally receives no salary for this, who I now also consider a very dear friend. Thank you, Andrea, for taking the time from your very 7 days a week schedule to tell us from your perspective what's really happening at the border. So welcome, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was a wonderful welcome. And so I know some of your faces from some of you have come to Brownsville to work with Team Brownsville, and some of you I've seen on different immigration meetings that we've done. So I'm happy to be here. Now, who is in charge of the slides that I've prepared for us? Are you going to post those, Nancy? Uh-oh, we're going mute.
I think Catherine is. Catherine, we're ready for the slideshow. Or not.
Okay, well, let me just tell you that I have a PowerPoint ready to go, and not a very long one, just because I could just tell you about the work that we do and the work we are currently doing. So let's start with the present. Today, this week, this month, we are serving people 7 days a week in the Brownsville Welcome Center. Our numbers have changed over time. We've gone from a high of over 1,000 people right before Title 42 lifted. There was a surge of individuals that thought the border was closing. And so we got many, many people through at that time. Right now, we are at a low point, and we are actually receiving only about 100 people a day. So that's very low. So my presentation obviously concentrates on the work that we do on the southern border. We work in several different places. We work in Brownsville and Matamoros, the sister cities. We also provide support for individuals that are working in Reynosa, which is a sister city of Hidalgo or McAllen. Both of these cities are very much a big part of receiving asylum seekers who are applying through the CBP1 app, as well as asylum seekers who get to the border and don't really know how they're going to get across into the United States. They have the goal of seeking asylum, but there are different ways of coming into the United States. So our first priority is welcoming people. People come scared, people come in many different situations. Some have been really traumatized on their trip north, as well as going through whatever they went through in their home countries to make them decide to come to the border. It's a long and treacherous journey, and many of them have come through the Darien Gap.
Do you see it?
I can see it. Can you?
Oh, okay. Go for it then.
Okay.
I see it.
So when we,
There.
Border Patrol drops off individuals at our bus station area. Some of them are processed by the city of Brownsville. They kind of do the initial intake and talk to people about the need to get tickets and bus tickets, plane tickets. So their goal is to actually get people out of Brownsville as quickly as possible. Our goal is really different. Our goal is to provide welcome. And yes, it's wonderful when people can reunite with their families very quickly. It doesn't always happen that way. And some people come with very limited resources. So part of what we do is reaching the most vulnerable individuals and assisting with bus tickets or hotel rooms as needed. And I realize that's a very controversial issue, because the minute that you say that you're buying bus tickets, you can get swamped with people who say, I need you to buy me a bus ticket. So it's quite a procedure figuring out who are the most vulnerable, and we do it in a number of different ways. One, we always prioritize people that have infants and babies, women that are pregnant, and people with disabilities that would require extra care. Two, we prioritize at a little bit lower level, but we do get a lot of single individuals, men and women. We, as an organization and as part of a welcoming committee with other organizations, we kind of came up with a protocol and decided that for the single individuals, we would wait at least a week, which is a long time to wait, but it allows people to reach out to their own relatives or friends to figure out a way of getting their own tickets. And so we really want people to get their own tickets, or families to get their own tickets, but we also recognize that's not always possible. The same with hotel rooms. There are individuals that come that have been very, very traumatized on their trip north. And for different reasons, they need to have a night not in a shelter with a lot of other people. They just need a night to kind of compose themselves, to be able to take a shower, to sleep in their own bed, away from a lot of other people, and kind of mentally prepare themselves to go on for the rest of the journey. We do partner with other NGOs. Ministerio Una Misión is a really important partnership we have with Pastor Abraham Barberi. He did have a shelter in Matamoros for quite some time after the MPP encampment closed. And now he's working tirelessly in the encampment that exists, as well as in the new shelter that is around the old charity hospital that's called Pumarejo. So we partner with him. We partner to ensure that his eyes can be on the supplies that we are crossing. That he can make sure that when we are providing funds to fill the water tanks, that the water tanks are actually filled and that they're cleaned and that people have access to what we're providing. We're not there all the time. In fact, we're usually only in Matamoros once a week at the most. So there is a lot of time that we are not there and we don't have our eyes on everything that we're providing. So it works really well to partner with other organizations such as Ministerio Una Misión, the Angry Tias and Abuelas, and Solidarity Engineering are other groups, American-based groups, but working in Reynosa, in Matamoros, in different ways. Solidarity Engineering works a lot on providing clean water. They do a lot on making sure that the shelters and the encampments have sanitation enough for the amount of people that are there. They are involved in many different ways, everything from getting wells going to making sure that the water pumps work in larger shelters. Those are just a couple of the organizations that we work with, and really there are many, many smaller organizations in Mexico that do a tremendous amount of work. There are small churches that come into the encampments or to the main shelters, bringing food, bringing supplies, just ministering to people, and that is so critically important. These are just some pictures that are taken in the encampment area in Matamoros that exists now. It's an open air encampment. It's right on the river's edge. There's not much structure there. There is no boundary or fence around it like there was with the MPP encampment. So people basically arrive with very little. And we try to provide just some basics to make sure they have food, they have water. We provide some clothing. And like I said, Pastor Abraham has set up the water tanks in that encampment area so that they can be filled on a daily basis. And that's something that's really, really important. The water not only goes for drinking, but it also goes for washing, for bathing, for all the things that you need water for.
Andre, this is Jane Andrews. I'm sharing the screen, so please just tell me if you want me to advance to the next slide. Okay.
So pictures you're seeing here, the first picture is kids in the encampment. The second picture actually was taken in the bus station. So our work has shifted slightly. When we started out in 2018, we were able to distribute food and supplies within the bus station. Then post-COVID, things shifted. They didn't really want us so much inside the bus station. So we worked outside the bus station for a while in the area where people come in, get on and off the buses. So we stayed there for a number of months, and then we shifted again. Then the city said, no, we don't want you within the boundaries of the bus station. Now we've provided a space for you across the street from the bus station. So that's where we are now in what's known as the Welcome Center. And we work with another NGO group, Good Neighbor Settlement House. We work together to provide everything that people need coming in and traveling on to the next place. So basically food, toiletries, clothing for people that need shoes, baby supplies, just all the basics that you can think of that you might need as you're moving on to the next place. Shoes are a big thing that we provide. Many people come in flip-flops or shoes that have just walked through the Darien Gap and everywhere else, and they're wet and they're muddy, and the sole of the shoe is coming off. So we always have people asking us for shoes, and we do our best to try to meet the needs of the people that come through. Let's go to the next slide. So this is something that I was asked to address, and that I always address with groups that I speak to about immigration, because we just are the beginning for people's arrival into the United States. But I always say, you know, we're kind of like the welcome wagon. We get to greet people, we get to say welcome, and we're glad you're here, and here are some things that are going to help you on your way. But what we don't do is we don't get to actually settle people in the communities where they're going. And so all of you all across the United States in different places, you're the receivers. You are the ones that are going to see these people as they're arriving in your communities, and you are going to help determine what happens then. And so working for justice in your community is critical, because I've seen the pictures of what's happening in New York City and what's happening in Chicago, where the cities are getting overwhelmed with the numbers. Well, there are many communities around those cities that could be receivers of some of these asylum seekers. All they want is a place to land, a place where they can find a safe place to live, a place where they might find a job, a place where a community, to find the community that they were looking for when they imagined what it would be like to come to the United States. They need to find people that will help them find the school, the neighborhood school, register their child, maybe a faith community that's going to take them in and say, welcome, we're glad you're here. So that is critically important, is to find ways to support the new asylum seekers that are coming into your communities, and to, when I say look for opportunities to elevate the voices of those seeking refuge, talk to people. If you don't speak Spanish, find people who can speak Spanish. You will find leaders in those groups, especially if there's a large group of people coming into your community. Talk to them, find out what they need, what their expectations are, what they hope to do, and use their expertise to help with the whole process of settling them where they are. And I say, come and volunteer with us. There are people out there in the United States, wonderful people that want to come to the border. They just want to see what it looks like. What does it look like when people are arriving at the border? What does it look like when you're welcoming people? So we say, if you feel that call in yourself to volunteer, you are welcome to volunteer with us. But it is not mandatory, and there is so much to do out there all over the United States with these folks as they arrive where you live, that you can probably do just as much staying where you are as coming to the border. But still, I say, come if that's what you feel called to do.
Just to let you all know, we have entered Andrea's contact info in the chat box. And if you have difficulty retrieving it from the chat box, let me know. This is Catherine, and I will send it to you. And if you've given us your email address, then we'll send both Andrea's and our next speaker, Joanna's contact info to everybody who attends and tells us who they are.
So with that, I'll finish up. I know we're going to do questions and answers after both of our presentations. There's a lot of information that I didn't share with you because we have a very short amount of time. But if you have questions that you would like to ask, feel free to do that in that section of the presentation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Andrea, for that really inspiring presentation. And I know that there will be questions later. And if you do want to ask a question, please put it in the chat, and I'll be moderating the chat and try to get everybody's questions answered after our next presentation. Now, it is my great honor to introduce Joanna Williams. Both personally and professionally, Joanna was my student at Georgetown University, where she was doing her bachelor's degree at the School of Foreign Service. And it's been fabulous for me to see just how she's evolved into one of the leading advocates for migrants, not just on the US-Mexico border, but also the work that she's done inside Mexico and elsewhere. She is the executive director of the Keno Border Initiative that's in Tucson, Arizona area. And the KBI has programs that focus on humanitarian aid, accompaniment of migrants who are coming through their sector, education and advocacy. And I'm sure that Joanna will tell us more about each of these. In her own prior to taking on the responsibilities as executive director of the Keno Border Initiative, she did advocacy work with the Jesuit network, migration network of Central America. She also had a Fulbright scholarship after her she finished her bachelor's degree, and that was looking at the reintegration of those who were deported from the U.S. Into Mexico. And she has a master's degree in public policy from Arizona State University. She's one of the most knowledgeable practitioner researchers in this area. And I'm sure that we're going to learn an awful lot from her presentation. So Joanna, you're going to share your screen.
Yeah, I will in a moment. I'll just say a few words before I start
Sure.
sharing some images. Thank you so much, Susan, for that wonderful introduction. I hope to live up to it in the next 10 to 15 minutes of the presentation. I probably won't be able to resist the temptation to quote Susan, since I do on a weekly basis in my work here, since she taught me so much about asylum and refugee law that still informs our work here at the Keno Border Initiative. So just briefly, the Keno Border Initiative, we're just, for those of you who aren't familiar with the geography of the border, Andrea was mentioning a bunch of different cities, and you might have gotten a little confused. Texas has a lot more little cities that are together. Arizona is a little more remote throughout the border area. But most of the Team Brownsville work that Andrea was talking about was on the US side of the border, and then she mentioned some of the assistance on the Mexican side of the border. Almost all of the work that the Keno Border Initiative does, humanitarian work, is on the Mexican side of the border, but we are a binational organization. And for us to be binational is an administrative matter in a lot of ways. So we exist as two legal entities. We exist as a legal entity in the US and a legal entity in Mexico. It wasn't until I became executive director that I started to understand the headache of following two different regulations and having two different labor laws and so on and so forth. But really for us, binationality is also core to the ethos of our work, because we believe that if we're going to talk about a world that transcends borders or a world of solidarity across borders, we have to figure out how to live that out in our own organization. How do we navigate having Mexican staff and US staff? How do we navigate some of the cultural dynamics and the power dynamics that come alongside that. And that's what we think gives us a certain credibility in our work. And we're also a Catholic organization. I apologize, I think my daughter really would like to join this presentation. So if you hear her screaming in the background, that's my 3-year-old. So we're also a Catholic organization, and we work in 3 different dimensions. So I'll go ahead and share my screen now. Susan already started to mention it. But the first dimension is what we would call humanitarian assistance or holistic accompaniment. So the picture that hopefully you're seeing is the picture of our shelter on the Mexican side of the border. So we're located in Nogales, which Nogales, unlike some of the cities that Andrea named along the Texas border, Nogales was actually one city until the time of the Gadsden Purchase. So we call it Ambos Nogales because it's literally a city with a wall in the middle of it. So you can cross, there's a wall on, and there's houses on one side of the street and houses on the other side of the street. But this shelter is about 100 yards south of the US-Mexico border on the Mexican side. And there we provide a variety of services to families. So we have about 90 people staying overnight in our shelter. We serve a couple hundred people during the day with meals. We've served about almost 200,000 meals so far this year. We provide medical attention. So we've served over 2,500 people with medical attention in our shelter. We have a doctor on staff in a first aid area and collaborate with volunteers as well in that. But when we talk about this idea of holistic accompaniment, it goes beyond the humanitarian services we provide, because holistic accompaniment is really seeing someone as more than their migration experience. These were people first before they were displaced by a variety of factors. So how can we create spaces where they can reclaim some of that humanity and just be ordinary? So an example of that would be this morning, our livelihoods project coordinator, the person who tries to help people find economic opportunities on the Mexican side, wrote a message to our team and said, hey, there's a woman from Guatemala that just arrived that could make homemade tortillas. How many of you all will put in an order for if she starts producing tortillas? And so then we, everyone from the team jumped in and said, oh, I'll take a kilo, I'll take this, that, and the other thing. But it's really a process of discovering what are people's gifts and how can we celebrate that and then also use those as sources of resilience. So we have social workers and psychologists on staff as well that will do workshops around managing emotions and managing trauma, but also discovering hope and discovery and planning for the future. And then we also provide legal assistance and orientation on both the Mexican law and the US law, because some people are looking to integrate into Mexico or get legal status in Mexico. So we'll have an immigration attorney in Mexico that helps them do that process. And then we also have US attorneys in a collaboration with an organization called the Florence Project that come down and offer up orientations around asylum and what does it take to qualify for asylum, so that people can really weigh their cases before they decide whether to move forward with entry into the US. It made my day about 4 months ago. We had an immigration attorney from Chicago that was coming down and visiting just to get to know the organization. And she pulled me aside and she said, Joanna, my KBI clients are my most favorite clients because they always show up with their case files prepared. They always show up with a better perspective on what is it the process that they're getting into. And that for me was the fruit of both the legal assistance, but also the psychological work that creates a space where people can make decisions and really think through in a way that you can't when you're just in emergency survival mode. So that's one dimension of our work. And then we also believe in becoming a museum one day. We would love, I've got several alternative careers set out for myself once we don't need to exist as an organization. And in order to accomplish that, we have to do education and advocacy work, which I call changing hearts, minds, and policy towards a world of migration with dignity. So our education work is on both sides of the border, trying to help people better understand the realities of migrants and build empathy. So one of those pieces actually was published by Georgetown University Press Not, I don't think, at Susan's intervention, just because there's lots of wonderful people at Georgetown that support our work and found this to be valuable. But it's a compilation of testimonies of migrants who have come through KBI over the years. And in many ways, we create spaces of encounter so that people can hear migrant stories firsthand and allow themselves to grow in empathy. And that's really important. I think many of you are coming from the US side, and so you understand the importance of that in the US, where anti-immigrant sentiment and the demonization of immigrants is on the rise. But it's also very important in Nogales, Mexico. I was just the other day waiting for a bus, and a woman said to me, "Oh, I'm really worried about all these, migrants who are here in Nogales, Mexico. When my husband crossed, her husband had been undocumented in the US. They both lived in Nogales, Mexico now, but her husband had been undocumented in the US. She said, well, when my husband crossed, people were really going for a good reason, but I don't know these new arrivals, what their rationale is. So it's really important for us to continue to do community education on the Mexican side of the border, because we can also experience xenophobia and racism in Mexico and not just in the United States. And then we do a lot of policy and advocacy work. So some of that is documentation of trends. We do intake interviews with everyone who arrives to our shelter. So we'll file complaints, for example, if there's an abuse by the Department of Homeland Security, if somebody has been, we had one situation where a man was crossing the desert and he was run over by a Border Patrol agent driving an ATV. And so we filed a complaint on his behalf and advocated for a year on that case, and actually got to a place where the Customs and Border Protection found that the complaint was justified and recommended disciplinary action against the agent. So that's the exception, not the norm. Most of our complaints go unheard or unanalyzed, but it was heartening to see some fruit from that. And Andrea mentioned that, many of the people in this migrant community already have their own leadership abilities, have been leaders in their communities. And so that's a lot of our philosophy of our advocacy work, is really just to create a platform for them and the leadership training that they need so they can raise their voices. So it's really wonderful. A few weeks ago, we were able to fly out to DC with Lixiana, who's a Venezuelan woman who came through KBI under MPP, which I'll mention in a moment. But she just won her asylum case. She lives in Las Vegas, Nevada, and just won her asylum case. And she was able to go to DC and share with groups of young people, but also with congressional offices, about the impacts of border policy and how that had an effect on her specifically in her journey. And this picture is a picture of a march in Nogales that was organized by the kids. So for those of you who don't speak Spanish, the sign says "Kids Waiting for Asylum." And where the migrant kids wanted to stand up and share their voices and talk about how is this limbo in Nogales affecting them. So that's some of the advocacy work that we do in brief. I think there's a couple of important pieces to touch on to really understand the situation at the border. One is that we oftentimes talk about push factors. So why are people leaving their home communities? And these are some data on how that's shifted, at least in the population we see over the years. But it's really important to understand too that how hard people are trying to stay, and just the wrenching nature of this decision to leave. So take Walter, for example, who's the man who's pictured here. Walter lived in Honduras and had a decent job, and then also owned his own small business. And then the pandemic hit, and so he lost his first job. And then the hurricanes hit Honduras in the fall of 2020, and his business and his land were destroyed. And so he moved somewhere else in Honduras to try to stay in the country. And then he was targeted by organized crime, by the gangs there, because he was now recognized as somebody who was not from that particular neighborhood. And so maybe he was an interloper, maybe he was with a different gang. And so he was targeted and threatened. And it wasn't until one of his relatives was harmed that he finally said, as much as I've tried to stay here, I tried to stay here after I lost my job. I tried to stay here after my business was destroyed, but I just can't anymore. I just don't see a way forward. And he, to this day, really misses the life that he had in Honduras, and way that his family was able to be and enjoy the weekends together. But that's the kind of wrenching decision that people make to leave, whether that's economic reasons. That, as you can see on these pie charts, it used to be much more common that people would leave for economic reasons. So in 2016, 70% of the people that we received said that trying to find prosperity or economic well-being was their primary reason for migration. And now, just 7 years later, over 75% of people say that violence is their main reason for migration. But in both of those cases, it's people who are struggling to try to stay or even to try to move within the same country that then aren't able to. Most of the people that we're receiving are actually Mexican. So I gave the example of Walter, who's Honduran, but we're still seeing about 60 to 70% of our population is Mexican. So when they're with us, they're technically qualified as internally displaced people. So they haven't actually crossed an international border before coming to us. And many of them have been influenced by the increasing destabilization in Mexico, as demand for drugs has shifted and increased in the US, and organized crime groups have fractured on the Mexican side. So just last week, for example, we received a family whose oldest son, who was 18 at the time, was disappeared by the organized crime group in the area. In other words, they don't know if he was killed or not, but they have not found him. So he might be kidnapped, he might be killed. They don't have a body. And so for 2 or 3 years, this family just kept trying to go to the public prosecutor office and search for answers, or go to mass graves and try to see if they could find their son. And then they started to get threatened, because that started to feel like a threat to the organized crime group, and said, you need to stop this search. You shouldn't be advocating for your son. And even then, when they moved somewhere else in Mexico, that group followed up with them and continued to threaten them. So we see, people's efforts to find some kind of closure amidst a situation of violence leads to then further persecution and further displacement. But it's a tricky reality, because that particular case may qualify as political action under the asylum definition. But I mentioned I wasn't going to be able to resist quoting Susan. One of the things that I learned in her asylum and refugee class, one of her quotes that I quote all the time here is, asylum isn't given for fear of death. It's given for fear of persecution. And so just because someone's displaced from violence doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to win their legal case in the US. And that's why it's so important for people to really carefully analyze their cases. And I can go in a little bit more depth if people are interested in that distinction. I can talk about that a little more in the Q&A section. But people have these shifting reasons that they're leaving their hometown, then they're arriving the US-Mexico border, and what they're encountering is what I would call policies of exclusion. Susan already started to talk about some of the history of this. I won't take the sweep of all 100 years, but these policies of deterrence that she noted from the 1990s, when you talk about deterrence, really the philosophy of it is, can we make people suffer more? Because maybe if we make them suffer more, they won't try to cross. So it's meant increasing security in urban areas so that people are pushed further and further out into the desert in their crossing attempts. And that has dramatically increased the number of people who die in the crossing attempt. You can see on the photo on the left is a cross where one set of remains, those of Gerson, were found out in the desert. But we're also seeing this with asylum policy. So I've been here for many years at Kino. It doesn't seem like that distant of the past when I remember coming across a family that was seeking asylum down at the downtown port of entry, and this was in 2016, and them saying, well, we're trying to find protection in the US. And I remember very distinctly looking at the pedestrian line to cross the port of entry, and it looked like it was going to be about a 30-minute wait. And I said, gosh, that just seems too long. How about you come over, have breakfast at our aid center, we'll talk a little bit more, then you can come back here and see if you want to keep seeking asylum. I mean, now families are stranded for months and months in Nogales. 30 minutes would be my dream scenario for access to asylum at the border. But there's been layers of policies that have limited that access to asylum. We don't have the time to unpack all of them, but since you all are people with League of Women Voters and are interested in policy and advocacy, I wanted to at least name 5 that are currently in place. So I think the most important for us at KBI is what is the top right corner, which is metering or turnbacks and the prioritization of CBP1 processing. So just to unpack that a little bit more, what metering means is that this family that would normally just walk up to the port of entry and say, I'm afraid, and then start the asylum process, they're now told by Customs and Border Protection that there's not space, that they need to wait their turn. And then they join these long lists on the Mexican side to try to get a turn to present their asylum case. And what the US government is trying to direct people towards is a cell phone app, which Andrea referenced, that's called CBP1. So they have to download this app and then try every day to get an appointment. So we have an IT workshop here in Nogales several days a week because there's always problems and questions with the app. So today, for example, we had somebody that had gotten their appointment and they just have to confirm their appointment. But when they tried to confirm their appointment and take the photo so that the facial recognition would work, it wouldn't allow them to do that. And they only have 23 hours to confirm their appointment. So this person was frantically going around the shelter and trying to find anybody that they could to see how they could get this appointment confirmed so that they could really be processed in a few days. But that's just the reality of our day-to-day reality of navigating this cell phone app as the access to asylum at the border. The other things that we're seeing more regional immigration control and deterrence. So the border does not start in the US-Mexico border. There's been a lot of investment in Mexican immigration to try to detain people before they reach the border and remove them to countries. We also, a new policy that was implemented in May is what we call the asylum ban, what the Biden administration calls the circumvention of legal pathways legislation, which means that if people don't use the CBP1 cell phone app to seek asylum, then the bar for how they qualify for their case is much, much higher. And that might affect them at the border. If they're a single adult, they might be held in detention and denied at the border. Or if they're a family, they might think that they've started the process, but by the time they get to more of a decision stage, this asylum ban will take effect and will hurt them, especially if they're in the other policy that's in the bottom right, the Family Expedited Removal Management Program, which is where the Biden administration is trying to speed up the removals of families and has them go through an asylum interview within about 10 days of their arrival to the US. So sometimes 3 days after they made it to their destination city, they have to present their asylum case. And the idea of that is to try to deny more cases and remove folks more quickly to, again, deter them from coming. And then we're also seeing expanded destinations for removals. So it used to be that the US would not remove people back to Venezuela because we didn't have diplomatic relations with Venezuela. And just last week, we had a Venezuelan who arrived who said he was really worried about whether or not he should go forward with his asylum claim because he said all of the other Venezuelans that I was traveling with were just removed to Venezuela by the US government. And I'm worried that that will happen to me. And that's a very new policy that the US has had to remove people back to Venezuela. So those are a few of the policies. Again, they would take another several hours to talk through all of them. But the reality is that what the current policies create is then a limbo in Nogales. We used to be a place of very short-term displacement. We would used to serve people for a few days and they would move on. And now we have families like this one, this mom and her daughter, who have already been in Nogales for 3 months and probably will be in Nogales for 4 or 5 more months. And they stay in shelters for their initial time in the city, but then they're renting in poor conditions. So you can see the picture of one of the rooms that the family's renting, that basically they rent one room and then fill it up with mattresses. Oftentimes don't have access to running water or electricity. There is one mom who really wants her kids to be in school, but she can't afford the paper that the school asks her to supply for her school kids to be enrolled in Nogales, Mexico. And she also can't cook at her house because she can't afford the electricity to have a hot plate that she could use to cook. So people are just trying to patch together what they can. You know, I already mentioned the Guatemalan woman making tortillas, really patch together what they can to exist in this space of limbo and temporary displacement, or medium-term displacement, really. And there's some differences in Nogales versus other parts of the border. So relative to the Texas border, we're relatively safer. But migrants are still very much targeted by organized crime, and because they're recognizable here. And so organized crime groups will harass them or will try to recruit their kids to drug trafficking, or will rob them on the Mexican side of the border. So those are some of the realities people have to navigate here. But the journey doesn't start here, it doesn't end here. I think as you all think about what this means from the policy perspective, I almost would argue, and Susan might disagree with me here, oftentimes we're talking too much about the border now, when really the question needs to be more holistic of what does immigrant integration look like in the United States and what happens when people make it to the US. So there's a few pieces of legislation and policies to keep your eyes on. One is the Asylum Seeker Work Authorization Act, which would allow people to get work permits more quickly. There's also issues around shelter and services funding. So we don't receive any funding from the federal government. We only receive funding from private individuals. But some of the people on the US side of the border who are sheltering migrants are receiving shelter and services program funding, and that's a real lifeline for everything that they do. And so in this funding debate that we're having actively this week and in the coming months, it's really important that that funding be available. There's also proposals to make immigration court more friendly for children and actually set up a separate immigration court for unaccompanied children that could be incredibly helpful for them in their cases. And then there's a variety of state level policy issues relating to educational inclusion, healthcare, other matters that I think are critical, again, because the focus can't exclusively be on the border. It's a question of what happens once people are in their community. And this is a picture of some of the work that we're doing in that accompaniment. This is from the Phoenix area. We've got about 30 of the people who have come through KBI who have now settled in Phoenix. And so our social worker is now following up with them and creating spaces of inclusion and community and integration in Phoenix, in Denver, and Atlanta, and some of our main destination cities to help people navigate their new lives in the US as they await their asylum decision. So there's a lot of challenges on the journey. I think my invitation for you all would be to not be paralyzed by the suffering. I think one of the beautiful things about being at the border on a day-to-day basis is that we see so much joy and so much hope. This is a photo of Claritza and her little son, who we call baby Kino. His real name's Victor, but who was baptized at our shelter. We just had Dia de los Muertos, so we just had All Souls Day, and we had time for the kids to paint each other's faces and write poems. People exist in their fullness of humanity, and joy and hope are part of those dimensions. And when you're here on a day-to-day basis, you see more of that joy and hope than you do of the suffering. And I think that that's a really important thing for us to remember, and something that might energize us forward in this work. So here's my contact information. As somebody mentioned, that'll be shared in the chat. We do welcome volunteers as well, just like Andrea mentioned. We ask people to make a 6-week commitment if they're going to come down and volunteer for us, which might be, I'm not sure how that compares to Team Brownsville's commitment. And we also accept, of course, your financial contributions. As I mentioned, we are a nonprofit, and we are entirely funded by private individuals. And then we also would invite you to take action on advocacy. I already gave you plenty of ideas of legislation, and I'm sure that we can discuss more. But I look forward to hearing your questions and really appreciate your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Joanna. And I think that those of you who've been listening to her know why she was my favorite student while I was teaching. Thank you. And I actually do agree with you that a lot more attention needs to be put on what's happening more holistically within the country and not just focusing in on the border. So I'm glad that you raised that. We're starting to get some questions, and I have some that I were suggested even before the meeting started. So, but I want to take you up, but Joanna and also Andrea, on Joanna's last point, in terms of there being a lot of advocacy that can be done. The League is, most of the audience know as members of the League, will always make its advocacy based on evidence. And some of the statistics that you showed were really useful. And evidence is not just academic evidence, it's also evidence derived from lived experiences. So if you're, I'm going to ask you to really try to prioritize. What do you see as the most important reforms that are needed in our immigration system and the way things function at the border, and then onward into the interior, that would improve the situation for the migrants at the border, in a context which would also be acceptable to the American public? And I'm going to start with you, Joanna, because that's where you kind of ended. If you could, do a little bit more in terms of just the priorities for instituting reform.
Sure, I'll answer your question two ways, because I'm not sure that the most important is the most politically viable. But I think that if we had a robust system of case management and legal representation that then also allowed for quicker adjudication of cases, those two hand in hand could work together well. Because I think there's a lot of, we don't want people to wait 6 or 7 years for their asylum case. That's an untenable situation. There's ways that we could expedite cases in a way that's damaging because people didn't get the assistance they need beforehand. So if we coupled those two, I think it could improve people's outcomes, but also improve the reliability and viability of the system. And that would require, investing a lot more resources, not just in the court level, but at the USCIS level. The Biden administration made an effort towards this that they haven't actually implemented, that it would allow asylum officers to adjudicate cases, even if they're defensive immigration cases. And that could take some of the burden off of the immigration court for some of the more straightforward cases. I mean, asylum officers see all kinds of cases and are really great experts on this. But that to me is the single thing that would be the most helpful right now in restoring the reliability of our asylum system. I think the ones that are most politically viable right now are some of these more smaller fixes that I named, like the children's court. I think we might get some momentum around, and is supported in a bipartisan way. The work authorization as well, depending on what the terms of it are. So those are the ones that I see most likely moving more quickly, but hopefully we can maintain that other piece in mind, and because that's what makes the biggest difference to the families here.
Yeah, I just to explain to those who don't follow these issues as closely, what Joanna was referring to two major problems that we're seeing. One is the lack of legal representation for people who are applying for asylum. And some of the research shows that people are as much as 6 to 10 times more likely to actually prevail in their asylum application if they do have legal representation. But also legal representation means that some people with weak cases are taken out of the system, and there's an effort to find other alternatives for them. But the second problem is this growing and very, very large backlog in asylum processing, and that really has paralyzed the system in many ways. And so I think those are very useful things for us to think about. Andrea, would you like to add on to that?
I guess what I would add is just my observation in the Welcome Center and based on what people say to us. And their priorities are always more information about how to go forward with their asylum case. And of course, they want an attorney. They want to know how to get a pro bono attorney. And what we've found is that there just aren't enough pro bono attorneys to really meet the needs of all the people that are coming through. So people are given a sheet of paper that lists organizations in major cities throughout the country, but yet we know from feedback that many times they contact that organization, and many times it's Catholic Charities, because Catholic Charities has you know, kind of hubs in lots and lots of the major cities. But the information we're hearing back is that many times they're told, no, we don't have staff to help you. We don't have an attorney here that can take your case. So it's not that we're giving them unrealistic expectations, but they're just really, there are not enough people to assist with legal cases. And just as an aside, I took module 1 of the Vista program through Villanova University, and that's all about accompaniment and also about non-lawyers being able to represent people as an accredited representative under Department of Justice organization. So I know that more people are going through that program and more people have that interest, but I think it's going to be quite an effort to actually meet the needs of all the people that are coming through, who kind of have that expectation that they will get a pro bono attorney.
Thank you. I encourage everyone to put in some questions in the chat, but I still have some questions that are already there. Okay, Catherine has said, Joanna spoke about the change in reasons for immigrating between 2016 and 2023, and the big switch between economic reasons and escaping violence. She's asking, has violence grown so dramatically in Central America, Mexico, elsewhere, or is it because US laws have changed for asylum?
So I think there's probably 4 reasons. One is definitely the shift in US laws, where we're seeing more asylum seekers on the Mexican side that we would have never had contact with because they would have just been processed and moved on in their asylum cases. And instead they're being sent back to Mexico, or they're not able to move forward with their cases. So some of that is because of the particularity of our geography and how US laws are excluding asylum seekers. A second reason is actually the internationalization of migration through this corridor. So it used to be extremely uncommon to see anyone other than Mexicans and Central Americans here. And now it's very common to see Venezuelans and Cubans and other nationalities. We would lump it all in that pie graph as violence. Really, that's more political persecution as well. We just have to have simple intake questions, so forgive us for lumping together categories. But actually, the non-Mexican, non-Central Americans make up now more than half of the people who are crossing the border, and so that's a shift that you're seeing as well. And I think the third is not. Some of it is an increase in the violence itself. I think it's more a decrease in people's optimism and belief that that violence will stop. And I did, when Ken Salazar, who's the US ambassador to Mexico, came and didn't visit us at our aid center, but invited me to a meeting while he was visiting the region and was in Nogales. And so before I met with him, I said, well, I'm going to do a focus group with some of the migrants here, trying to see what is it, since he's not choosing to come to KBI and talk to migrants directly, what is it that's really important that the ambassador needs to take away in terms of why people are leaving their home communities. And over again, I heard from people, it's not really the violence, it's the corruption. Because if there's violence, but then there's some access to justice, then we'll we can believe and have faith that the violence isn't going to end. But when there's deep-seated corruption, when I've been searching for justice for my disappeared son for 3 years, and I know that the prosecutor's office is in cahoots with organized crime, then that's what makes people give up hope that it will change in the future. Unfortunately, Ambassador Salazar hasn't been great on anti-corruption efforts in Mexico, so I don't know that my message sunk in, but at least I can share with you all the message that the migrants shared with me in terms of how that's shifting people's belief of their prospects for a future in their home communities.
Good. We have a question also in the chat about from Jane is, have each of you seen changes in the numbers of people crossing during the past year, and to what do you attribute that? And also, are you aware of an increased number of people being removed, deported immediately without asylum process? Yeah, you touched on that a bit already, but maybe Andrea, would you want to start talking about the ups and downs in the process?
Yes. So last fall, our major population coming into the Welcome Center was Nicaraguans. And at that time, we were running about 90% Nicaraguan, and then with just a sprinkling of Venezuelans and Central Americans. And then come spring, let's say by February, the numbers of Nicaraguans dropped dramatically, and big shift to Venezuelans. And we have stayed pretty steadily, heavily Venezuelan. There have been times when the Venezuelan population has shifted a bit in response to a certain new law that was coming out. People are fearful that they're not going to be able to come, and so more come, or they're told that, okay, the door is going to close for Venezuelans. So we have definitely seen those shifts. The other thing that's interesting is that we were getting more Haitians in the spring, and we saw more Haitians on the other side of the border as well, in Matamoros, in Reynosa. The numbers of Haitians dropped quite a bit by this summer, and now the number of Haitians is picking up again. So we are seeing more Haitians. We are seeing a few people coming from a couple African countries, Cameroon specifically, Senegal. We've gotten a number of asylum seekers to those countries. And then also we occasionally get some people from Russia and Georgia, as well as occasionally we get people from India and Bangladesh. So there's always a sprinkling of people from a variety of different areas of the world, but predominantly right now it's Venezuelans. Probably 95% of the people that are coming through our Welcome Center are Venezuelans. And then of course it just drops off dramatically after that.
I think Andrea has more of the pulse on the diversity of nationalities, because we know that there's people moving through this border area that are getting released on the US side that aren't coming to our aid center. But we saw numbers fluctuate especially in July and August is when our numbers started to climb up, which is consistent with what we were seeing along the border. We haven't seen an increased number of people being removed or deported without an asylum process. And simply because the most draconian law that was removing and deporting people, actually expelling them is the technical term, without an asylum process was Title 42. So we would see that consistently every day, dozens of families a day, up until the end of Title 42, which was in May of this year. So in the last 6 months, we haven't seen that level of consistency in terms of people being expelled without a process. But we certainly have our finger on the pulse of you know, when Border Patrol starts to get some pressure to not release as many families into the US, and all of a sudden we see a bunch of families that have claimed asylum that are getting sent back to Mexico, and then we raise our voices here and file a bunch of complaints and try to push back on that. So it's a little bit more of a give and take of advocacy in that right now, because legally they can't remove someone without access to asylum process if that person has claimed asylum. Though they're certainly trying to, in many ways, do what we call coerced voluntary returns here of Mexican families. But it was much more across the board under Title 42, and there was really very little we could do under Title 42 to protest against those expulsions.
A related question there, it was just basically for both of you. How many migrants do you expect you will have served by the end of this year? Andrea?
I wish I had all my my paperwork in front of me, because there were days in April that we were getting almost 1,000 people a day. Right before Title 42 lifted, we had several weeks where our numbers were going up to 800 to nearly 1,000 people a day. And now our numbers are lower. So I don't know what number will add up to by the end of the year. I mean, it's in the, I mean, it could be 100,000. I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure, because we certainly have gone very high and now we're lower, but not sure. Oh, one thing I did want to say is that people coming through like I said, the vast majority are Venezuelans, and they know that people are getting expelled. They know they're getting both expelled into Mexico and they're getting deported back to Venezuela. And those deportation flights happen to be taking off from our airport in Harlingen, which is about a half an hour away from Brownsville. And so if you were to go to that airport, you could see those flights leaving from Venezuela. So that's a really, really scary thing. The other thing that's happened several times already is that, so Border Patrol makes a decision when they're taken to the processing area about what will happen to a given family. And we've seen it happen before where part of the family is determined to be the nuclear family, parents and children, and they are allowed to be released into our city and come to our welcome center. A grandparent, a mother of one of the parents is determined to be a single adult, and she is expelled back into Mexico by herself. And this has happened several times already. Of course, it's very upsetting for the families, because they have to make a decision when they get to the United States about what are they going to do. Are they going to try to stay near the border and try to wait and see if their parent or whoever it is can maybe come through CBP-1 and come back into the United States? Or are they going to go on to their destination? And that's just one of those decisions that's happening every day, that people are being pressured to make decisions like that, and you know, it's not something that we can tell them what to do. They just have to make that decision themselves, what they think is going to be best for their family in that moment. So certainly these laws are very much affecting individuals, families every day.
So we're looking at probably having served 9,000 to 10,000 by the end of the year. We had a couple of months there we were serving over 1,000 individuals per month. And again, the difference is that when we were serving, 8,000 to 9,000 for 6 to 7 months at a time. So that's why the numbers in the 200,000 meals don't seem to add up. It's because people come and stay and are here for a while.
Another question from let's see, Julie. How is seasonality affecting your work? Some immigrants who were sent to Chicago are choosing to go back to Venezuela or Texas or somewhere warmer because the shelters aren't warm enough in winter. Work permits aren't available quickly, neither is permanent housing.
So seasonality used to be a really big factor in our work. We would see peaks in March and October because those are the best times of the year. There's no good time of the year to cross the desert, but those are the least deadly times of the year to cross the desert because it's neither too cold nor too hot. And we would see almost no migration in June and July. And we've got temperatures over 100 degrees. It's not physically possible to carry enough water to stay hydrated in the desert for more than about 3 hours in the summer. That seasonality has really declined with all of this confusing mix of policies and shifting rumors, the ones that Andrea mentioned. We are the peaks and the valleys are much more dependent now on what policies are coming, what policies are implemented, what policies are rumored. And we're not seeing that as tied to the actual weather seasons as we did when I first started at KBI back in 2015.
Anything to add, Andrea?
Only that our city of Brownsville has chosen to use the state buses, in other words, Abbott buses, to their advantage. And so they are vetting people. In other words, they're requiring people to have a name and address of a sponsor or family member in the city that they wish to go to. So we have state buses going, leaving every day, every other day to New York, to Chicago, to Denver, to LA. And those cities are calling back to us saying, please, try to provide jackets and warm weather clothing for the people, which we are trying to do. We need help from everywhere. And I also wish that those cities would realize that we who are on the border don't have the kind of cold weather clothing most of the time that you would have in Denver or you would have in Chicago. So we may be able to come up with a jacket, but they're going to have to get much more when they get to Chicago that's going to make, things weather appropriate. Honestly, people just really do not know how cold it's going to be when they get to Chicago. And we can tell them, but until they experience it, I don't think they really understand.
We're getting close to the end of our time, so I want to just ask one more question, and that's, is there any AI that can help answer the questions of asylum seekers and guide their completion of their final application forms, so in order to address some of the confusion and the angst about the asylum process? Joanna, you want to start again?
I don't know that it exists yet, but I think it's worth exploring. I think there's ways that technology can can at least assist some of the human intervention, like the programs like the Villanova program. And there's a couple, and the name is escaping me. There's a university that has a program looking into technology and how it intersects with the immigration process and creating efficiency.
That's Stanford.
Yeah, Stanford. That's right.
Yeah.
Because our bishop here was invited to consult with the project, and so he was talking with me about it before he was deciding on that. So it was the first time I'd heard of it from him. But I think it's a reasonable place to explore, and so maybe you all could help invent this.
So unless Andrea, you'd like to add on to that. Okay.
I don't really, I mean,
Okay.
AI is not something I'm thinking about. We're thinking about right now. I think that we do provide a lot of information via QR codes. I realize that's not AI, but that's about probably the most advanced technology that we have, just to be able to allow asylum seekers to scan something and then get a link to other information that will be important to their cases.
I want to get to conclude with, basically we are the League of Women Voters and to press you a little bit more on what we could be doing. And both as individuals who care about these issues, but also institutionally, and get some ideas for you as to how we should be proceeding in looking at these. And Andre, I'm going to start with you.
So you have two different things. One, if you're talking about specific political, specific, like addressing laws and things like that, I mean, you all are very, very knowledgeable, and you kind of have the pulse of what's going on in immigration. And so I know that you are protesters and letter writers and all those wonderful things, people that call congressmen, senators, things like that. And so all that kind of work is very important, just to keep it going, to have our people that are supposed to be representing us understand what's going on and what we want and what we need. What was the other half of your question? I've lost my train of thought, I think.
No, that was the question. You've just answered it. It's what we can as a league do.
The other part was just that you out in the communities can come together as organizations or faith groups or anything like that to support asylum seekers when they get to where they're going. There used to be a big effort, and I know it still goes on in some places, where churches, synagogues would sponsor a family and would kind of help that family, help set up the place for them, just make sure they could get on their feet, provide basic, food, clothing, supplies for a period of time, and then just kind of be the guardians of that family for a period of time, whether it be a year, 2 years. And I don't know if that's still going on in different communities. I think it is. My husband is from Minnesota, and I know that I've heard various churches from Minnesota talking about the work that they've done with receiving refugee families, and asylum seeking families are much the same as refugee families, I think.
Giovanna.
So I already spoke a little bit about the importance of immigrant integration and really not just looking at the border. I would argue that for your consideration at the league level, that a lot of those innovations and best practices do come from a local and state level. So it comes from what cities and states try out in their policy and find to be effective, and then can eventually get some traction at the national level. So I think those are great conversations to be having within your state league chapters, but also across the leagues, to think about how are we spreading these best practices between different states, and then throwing your weight behind key legislation or against key legislation at really strategic moments. I think that you can get really exhausted. I can get exhausted. I work in this full time. I can get exhausted by the cycle of immigration policy news, but it's helpful to know this actually is a crucial moment when maybe we can move work permits forward. This might be a crucial moment when all access to asylum at the border will disappear. So really choosing those strategic moments to mobilize, and doing that together with our families that have voices and opinions, and our leaders, and just need a platform. And if you're in any of the states that we have folks going to, I'd be more than happy to introduce you to some of our great advocates. They call themselves the Revolucionarios, the Revolutionaries. It's a group, a migrant leadership cohort that's organized for their rights when they're here on the Mexican side of the border, and now continue to do advocacy, like Lixiana, who, when it was a critical moment that Title 42 might have been expanded, she got all of her friends at work to make calls in to the Nevada senators to stop them from supporting that legislation. So I'm more than happy to connect you with some of those people if you want to advocate alongside them.
Great. Catherine, your hand is up.
Yeah, if I could just add one word for those of you for whom this is maybe your first contact with the League of Women Voters Immigration Interest and Advocacy Group, which is us. I would like to please encourage you to join us. And then we plan to do frequent or fairly frequent meetings of this nature. We also will, when we can, advocate vigorously for the right legislation and send you all the information you need to advocate with your particular elected representatives. So please, if you've put your contact info in the chat, we will get back to you, or just reach out to wherever you receive the invitation to come to this meeting, and we'll hook you up with our Google group so you can stay in touch. And I think Jane probably just add a word to that, because I see she's got her hand up.
Yes, so we do have a Google group, which is nationwide, of about 150 people. We send out noteworthy information about bills, legislation, articles, and we would be delighted to have all of you, any or all of you, join our Google group. But please send me your email address, and then I will add you to the list.
Thank you. Well, I'm actually going to turn this over to Nancy to thank everyone and say some final words.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Joanna and Andrea. I am just so impressed with what you guys are able to do day in, day out. It's exhausting even to hear about, much less the boots on the ground. So thank you for what you do. If there is anything specific that you could recommend for us to do, like tomorrow, that you really, really, really need right now, or you really, really want us to do right now, please let us know. Because a lot of these people that I recognize on this thing, they're worker bees, they're activists, they want to try to make a difference, and you guys are getting it done. So if you have anything, final words before we go.
What we need the most right now is winter clothes. We need jackets. We need jackets in all sizes. Y'all out there in the country have wonderful secondhand stores that, I mean, a jacket is something that you can often get fairly inexpensively and in good shape. And so send us jackets. We have a give back box label. We have it on our Team Brownsville website, or you can just go to Give Back Box and you can see the list of organizations that you can send packages to for $20. You basically click on the label of the organization you want to send a package to, and it costs $20 to send up to 70 pounds of merchandise. So you can send quite a big box for only $20 shipping. So that is really what we need right now, and will be needing for the next several months, in order to try to get people ready to go to northern climates, because everywhere is north from us.
Joanna, what about you?
So for those of you who aren't seeing the chat, very briefly, what you can do tomorrow: call your senator, oppose the elimination of access to asylum in exchange for Ukraine funding. That's a compromise that could very well come out of the Senate negotiations right now. And we need people to advocate for access to asylum.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. This has been very, very, very educational. Oh, Jane's got her hand up.
Yeah, I think it's important to say, and it's already in the chat, vote. Vote in your primaries, vote for your legislators. This is probably one of the most important things you can do. Inform people, get other people to vote.
So thank you all for attending. We look forward to seeing you at our next meetings, and please reach out to us. And thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Joanna. You guys, A+. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Great.
Bye.